You are 12 years old, and the morning mist sticks to the stone steps of the monastery like ghostly fingers. Your bare feet have grown numb from the cold as you kneel in complete silence, waiting. The older monk walks toward you, his silk robes making soft sounds against the wooden floor with every careful step. His eyes, which you've learned not to look at directly, move over your shaking body with the sharp attention of a trader studying something valuable. When his rough hand finally rests on your shoulder, you feel the weight of your new life wrapping around you like chains made from ritual and guilt. This is your first morning as a chigo, a temple boy, though you don't yet realize that your childhood has just been traded to feed desires that have no name in your small, scared world. The incense burns heavy in the prayer hall, but it can't hide the smell of fear that sticks to your skin. Behind you, in the shadows between the tall Buddha statues, other boys like you move with quiet skill. Some have been here for many months, others for much longer. Their eyes carry secrets you're not ready to know. Secrets about what happens when the temple bells stop ringing, and the world outside these walls forgets you ever existed. Welcome to old Japan, where beauty was like money and innocence was something taken by those in power. Welcome to a world where the line between true devotion and abuse became so unclear it disappeared, leaving behind only the faint sounds of young voices that were never meant to be broken. Before we dive into these lost stories of survival and pain, if you enjoy learning about the hidden sides of history that no one teaches you in school, consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it amazing that we're exploring these old stories together from different places around the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The story of male concubinage in ancient Japan isn't just about personal pain, it's about whole systems made to use up young lives. These weren't rare cases of harm, but well-established traditions that lasted for centuries, built into the core of Japanese society from Buddhist temples to samurai mansions to the floating world of Edo's pleasure district. In the mountain monastery of Koyasan, morning light rises over a scene that would play out thousands of times across old Japan. Young boys, some still very little, are being prepared for a life they can't yet understand. Their hair is being styled in the usual way of the chigo, partly shaved, with what's left carefully arranged to show off their youth and beauty. They wear silk robes that show they are special, placed above the regular temple workers. But these lovely clothes are really just golden cages. The practice of using chigo, young male attendants in Buddhist temples, began during the Heian period, around the 9th century AD. These boys were selected not for their spiritual devotion or intellectual promise, but for their physical beauty. Families, often desperate for economic relief or social advancement, would literally sell their sons to monasteries. The official story was education and spiritual guidance. The reality was something far more sinister. Records from temples across Japan reveal a systematic approach to acquiring these boys. Monks would travel to villages during times of famine or economic hardship, offering to educate male children in exchange for payments to the family. Some parents genuinely believed they were providing their sons with opportunities for advancement. Others knew exactly what they were selling but felt they had no choice. Once within the temple walls, the transformation of these children began immediately. The older monk, assigned as a spiritual guide called a ninsho, would begin the process of molding his young charge. This relationship, known as nan-shokyu or male colors, was presented as a sacred bond between master and student. In reality, it was institutionalized sexual abuse wrapped in religious ceremony. The daily routine of a chigo was a carefully orchestrated performance of subjugation. Before dawn, they would rise to attend to their ninsho's personal needs, preparing his bath, laying out his robes, serving his meals. They learned to move with the fluid grace expected of them, to speak only when spoken to anticipate their master's desires before they were voiced. Every aspect of their behavior was scrutinized and corrected. The physical abuse began gradually, often disguised as instruction in spiritual intimacy. The older monks had elaborate philosophies to justify their actions. claiming that the pure love between man and boy could lead to enlightenment. Buddhist texts were twisted to support these practices, with the concept of universal compassion perverted into a justification for sexual exploitation. Temple records from the medieval period, preserved in monasteries like Enryaku-ji on Mount Hiei, contain cryptic references to the education of Chiga. These documents use euphemistic language, but their meaning becomes clear when examined alongside personal diaries and letters that have survived. One 12th century monk's diary describes his instruction of a young boy named Kikumaru, detailing how he gradually introduced the child to increasingly intimate lessons, under the guise of spiritual training. The isolation of mountain monasteries made resistance nearly impossible. These boys had no contact with the outside world, no way to communicate with their families, and no understanding that what was happening to them was wrong. They were taught that their suffering was sacred, that their submission was a form of spiritual discipline that would benefit them in future lives. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. The monks created elaborate ceremonies around their exploitation, turning rape into ritual. Special seasonal festivals would celebrate the bond between Ninoro and Chigo, with the entire temple community participating in pageants that showcased the boys' beauty and submission. Some Chigo attempted to resist. Temple punishment records, hidden away in monastery archives, reveal the brutal consequences. Boys who refused their Ninoro's advances faced starvation, solitary confinement, and violent beatings. Some were permanently disfigured to serve as warnings to others. The documents describe punishments with clinical detachment. How many days without food? How many lashes with bamboo switches? How much spiritual correction was required to restore proper obedience? The most haunting records come from boys who internalized their abuse, who began to compete for the attention of their abusers. Temple writings describe Chigo who would perform increasingly degrading acts to gain favor, who would betray other boys to protect their own position. The system didn't just abuse these children, it taught them to abuse themselves and each other. As these boys approached adolescence, around 14 or 15 years old, their time as Chigo would typically end. Their voices would crack, their bodies would lose the androgynous beauty that had made them valuable. Some would be allowed to remain as junior monks, forever scarred by their experience. Others would be cast out entirely, thrust into a world they no longer understood with no resources or support. The lucky ones, if they can be called that, found their way to the samurai class. The warrior culture of medieval Japan had enthusiastically adopted the non-shoku traditions from the Buddhist monasteries, but with their own violent twist. Where the temples had cloaked their abuse in spiritual language, the samurai were more direct about their intention. In the military compounds and castle towns of feudal Japan, young boys, now called wakashu, served similar functions to the temple Chigo, but their suffering was flavored with the casual brutality of warrior culture. These boys, typically between 12 and 16 years old, were taken as apprentices by adult samurai. The official purpose was to learn martial arts, strategy, and the code of Bushido. The reality was that they served as sexual slaves for men who glorified violence as a way of life. The selection process for wakashu was even more ruthless than in the temples. Samurai would literally purchase boys from their families, treating them like weapons or horses, valuable tools to be owned and used. Some came from samurai families that had fallen on hard times. Others were the sons of merchants or farmers, seeking connections to the warrior class. All of them learned quickly that their bodies were not their own. Historical records from the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1333 AD, contain numerous references to the trading of wakashu among samurai. Letters between warrior lords discussed the quality of their boys with the same language they used for evaluating swords or armor. One document from 1267 describes a samurai named Minamoto Yoshitsune trading 2 wakashu to another lord in exchange for a particularly fine horse, noting that both boys were well trained in submission and skilled in the art of pleasure. The training of wakashu involved both martial and sexual education, often simultaneously. They learned to fight with weapons while being taught to submit sexually to their masters. This combination of violence and intimacy created a particularly twisted form of indoctrination. Boys who excelled at both aspects of their training were prized possessions, loaned out to other samurai as gestures of friendship or political alliance. The famous military chronicle known as the Heike Monogatari contains veiled references to the practice, describing how young warriors would serve their lords in all things, both in battle and in private chamber. The language is euphemistic, but historical context makes the meaning clear. These boys were expected to be ready to die for their masters in battle, and to submit to them sexually in peacetime. Personal accounts from this period, preserved in family archives, reveal the psychological devastation inflicted on these young warriors. One wakashu named Taira Shigemori left behind a secret diary, discovered centuries later in a hidden compartment of an old samurai residence. His entries describe years of ritualized abuse disguised as warrior training. He writes of being forced to demonstrate loyalty to his master in increasingly degrading ways, of competing with other wakashu for scraps of approval, and of learning to suppress all natural reactions to pain and humiliation. The samurai developed their own elaborate ceremonies around the exploitation of wakashu. The brotherhood contracts that formalized these relationships were public documents, signed before witnesses and blessed by Shinto priests. These contracts explicitly outlined the sexual duties of the younger partner, while wrapping them in the language of honor and loyalty. The boys would pledge to serve faithfully in body and spirit, while their masters promised to guide them in the ways of warrior virtue. Perhaps most chillingly, these contracts often included clauses about what would happen if the wakashu tried to resist or escape. The penalties ranged from ritual scarring to execution, all presented as natural consequences for breaking sacred oaths. The samurai legal code, the Gozubai Shikimoku, contains specific provisions for dealing with disobedient male attendants, treating their resistance as equivalent to military desertion. The competitive nature of samurai culture extended to their treatment of wakashu. Lords would display their boys at formal gatherings, comparing their beauty and training as they might compare their weapons or horses. Special contests were held where wakashu would demonstrate their skills, both martial and sexual, for the entertainment of their master's guests. Winners received rewards. Losers faced punishment that could be severe enough to leave permanent damage. Some wakashu, desperate to escape their situations, attempted to find protection through conversion to Buddhism or by fleeing to distant provinces. Temple records show that many were returned to their masters by monks who refused to harbor runaway property. Provincial authorities, dependent on the goodwill of local samurai lords, would typically return escaped wakashu without question, often after subjecting them to additional punishment for causing inconvenience. The most successful wakashu, those who managed to survive their apprenticeships without permanent physical or psychological damage, sometimes graduated to become samurai themselves. But even then, they carried the scars of their experience. Historical records suggest that many of these men went on to take their own wakashu, perpetuating the cycle of abuse that had consumed their own childhood. As Japan entered the Edo period 1603 to 1868, the practice of keeping male concubines evolved yet again, this time into the commercial sphere of urban pleasure districts. The rigid social hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan created new markets for sexual exploitation, and young men found themselves commodified in ways that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. The great cities of Edo, modern Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto became magnets for displaced samurai, ambitious merchants, and desperate families seeking economic opportunity. This concentration of population created both demand for sexual services and a ready supply of vulnerable young people who could be pressed into providing them. The authorities, rather than trying to suppress these activities, decided to regulate and profit from them. Male prostitutes in the Edo period were known as kajama, literally meaning shadow actors. This term captured the ambiguous nature of their existence. They were both performers and sexual servants, existing in the shadows between respectable society and the criminal underworld. Unlike their predecessors in temples and samurai compounds, kajama operated in a commercial marketplace where their suffering could be bought and sold by anyone with sufficient money. The development of licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara in Edo represented a new form of institutionalized exploitation. While these districts are often remembered for their female courtesans, they also housed thousands of male prostitutes who served clientele of all genders. The government's licensing system created a veneer of legitimacy, while ensuring that the profits from sexual exploitation flowed to official coffers. The procurement methods for kajama were as systematic as those used for temple chigo and samurai wakachu, but adapted to urban commercial reality. Procurers, known as zigen, would scout rural areas during times of economic hardship, offering to apprentice young boys in the entertainment trades. Families devastated by poor harvests or heavy taxation would sell their sons for immediate cash, often with contracts that amounted to indentured servitude lasting 10 years or more. Records from the Yoshiwara Pleasure Quarter, preserved in the Tokyo Metropolitan Archives, reveal the brutal economics of male prostitution. Boys as young as 11 were purchased for amounts equivalent to several years' income for a common laborer. The contracts specified that they would work until they had earned back their purchase price, plus interest, room and board, clothing, and various fees. The mathematics ensured that most would never achieve freedom. The daily life of a kajama was a performance of perpetual availability. They lived in specialized brothels called kajama jaya, shadow tea houses, where they were displayed for customers like merchandise in a shop. Their rooms were designed to showcase their beauty. Screens painted with erotic imagery, silk bedding in colors chosen to complement their skin tones, incense burners that filled the air with supposedly aphrodisiac scent. The training of kajama began immediately upon their arrival in the pleasure quarters. Older prostitutes, themselves victims of the same system, would teach newcomers the arts of seduction, submission, and survival. This education covered everything from sexual techniques to conversation skills, from makeup application to the subtle arts of gauging a customer's desires and adapting accordingly. The customer base for kajama reflected the full spectrum of Edo society. Wealthy merchants who couldn't openly keep wakashu-style concubines would visit kajama houses for discreet encounters. Samurai, now living on fixed stipends in an increasingly commercial economy, could rent what they could no longer afford to own. Even Buddhist monks, supposedly celibate, were regular customers at establishments that specialized in boys who resembled the chigo of temple life. Personal accounts from kajama who managed to buy their freedom or escape their contracts provide devastating insights into the reality behind the romanticized image of Japan's floating world. One such account, preserved in a private collection and only recently studied by historians, comes from a man named Konoika, who worked as a kajama in Osaka from 6. Kono describes the constant fear that permeated kajama life. Fear of violent customers, fear of disease, fear of aging out of desirability, fear of the brutal punishment awaiting anyone who tried to refuse service or escape. He writes of boys who killed themselves rather than continue their existence, of others who were beaten to death by customers and quickly replaced, of the casual cruelty that treated human beings as disposable objects. The health consequences for kajama were severe and often permanent. Without any medical care or protection, they were exposed to every sexually transmitted disease known to the period. Many suffered internal injuries from violent customers that were never properly treated. Malnutrition was common, as brothel owners found it more profitable to spend money on cosmetics and costumes than food. Perhaps most tragically, Kono describes the psychological manipulation used to keep kajama compliant. Like their temple and samurai predecessors, these boys were taught to blame themselves for their suffering. They were told that their beauty was a gift that they had a duty to share, that their role in providing pleasure was noble and necessary. Some began to believe these lies, developing twisted pride in their ability to endure degradation. The few who managed to escape or buy their freedom faced a society that offered them no place. They had no families to return to. Most had been sold by desperate parents who could not take them back. They had no marketable skills beyond those learned in the pleasure quarters. They carried diseases and psychological scars that marked them as outcasts. Many ended up returning to prostitution as the only life they knew. The most successful kajama might eventually become proprietors of their own establishments. But this success came at the cost of perpetuating the system that had destroyed their own childhood. These men, having survived the worst that commercial sexual exploitation could offer, often became the most ruthless exploiters of the next generation of victims. Government records from the late Edo period show occasional attempts to reform or regulate the treatment of kajima, but these efforts were always superficial. The authorities were more concerned with maintaining tax revenue from the pleasure quarters than protecting the lives of young prostitutes. When particularly brutal incidents came to official attention, the typical response was to transfer problematic brothel owners to different districts rather than prosecute them. The international opening of Japan in the 1850s brought foreign observers who documented what they saw in the pleasure quarters. Their accounts, while often colored by their own cultural biases, provide external verification of the systematic abuse of kajima. A British diplomat named Rutherford Alcock wrote extensively about his visits to Edo's entertainment districts, describing scenes of obvious exploitation that shocked him despite his familiarity with prostitution in London. As Japan moved toward modernization in the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, the traditional systems of male concubinage began to crumble, but not from humanitarian concern. The new government was embarrassed by Western criticism of Japanese sexual practices and sought to present a more civilized image to international observers. Laws were passed prohibiting the most obvious forms of child exploitation, but enforcement was sporadic and often motivated more by appearances than genuine concern for victims. The stories preserved in temple archives, samurai family records, and pleasure quarter documents reveal patterns that extended far beyond individual cases of abuse. These were systematic institutions designed to convert human suffering into spiritual, military, or economic benefit for those in power. The boys and young men caught in these systems were not victims of isolated predators, but products of entire social structures built on their exploitation. The physical suffering endured by these male concubines was only the beginning of their torment. The psychological manipulation, the destruction of their ability to form healthy relationships, the deliberate cultivation of shame and self-hatred, these injuries lasted long after the physical abuse ended. Many carried these wounds for their entire lives, never fully recovering their sense of human worth. Perhaps most tragically, the systems were self-perpetuating. Boys who survived their experiences often became the next generation of abusers, having learned no other model of power relationship. The cycle continued for centuries, each generation passing its trauma to the next in an endless chain of suffering. The historical record shows that resistance, while rare, did occur. Some temple chigo attempted to poison their master. Some samurai wakashu tried to kill their lords and themselves in dramatic acts of revenge. Some kagemo organized secret networks to help each other escape or at least survive. These acts of defiance were usually unsuccessful and always brutally punished, but they demonstrate that the human spirit could not be entirely crushed, even under such systematic oppression. The resistance began in whispers passed between boys who shared sleeping quarters in the dim corners of temple halls. In the winter of 1156 AD at the monastery of Toji in Nara, a chigo named Yoshimaru discovered something that would change everything he understood about his world. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the scripture storage room, he found a collection of letters, correspondence between monks, discussing the procurement of boys with the cold calculation of livestock traders. The one from Yamashina village shows promise, read one letter in elegant calligraphy. 12 years, fair complexion, family desperate after the rice harvest failed. Father agrees to terms, 50 monin now, 50 when delivered. Brother Kenro assures me the boy is untouched and properly fearful. Another letter detailed the breaking-in process. New arrivals require careful handling. Begin with small kindnesses, special food, warmer robes. This creates gratitude and dependence. Introduce physical requirements gradually, always within the context of spiritual instruction. By the third month, most offer no resistance. Yoshimaru's hands trembled as he read these clinical descriptions of his own experience and that of every chigo he knew. The spiritual bond he'd been taught to cherish was revealed as calculated manipulation. The sacred love between Ninsho and chigo was exposed as systematic rape wrapped in religious language. But it was the final letter that transformed Yoshimaru's horror into something approaching hope. Written by a monk named Shinran, it described his own years as a Chigo and his eventual escape. I have found others like us, former temple boys who survived and remember. We meet in secret, share information about which monasteries to avoid, which monks are the most dangerous. We cannot undo what was done to us, but perhaps we can prevent it happening to others. This letter contained something unprecedented. Names and locations of safe places, coded language for identifying other survivors, even methods for forging travel documents that might allow a Chigo to escape his monastery and disappear into the general population. Yoshimaru memorized every detail before carefully replacing the letters. That night, as his ninsho snored beside him, the boy began planning not just his own escape, but something far more ambitious. If there were networks of survivors, if resistance was possible, then perhaps the seemingly absolute power of the monasteries was not so absolute after all. The first step was finding other Chigo who might be ready to hear Hera truths. This required extraordinary caution. Many boys had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would report any sign of rebellion to their masters. Yoshimaru began with careful questions, testing responses, watching for signs of suppressed anger or desperate hope. His breakthrough came through a boy named Kenjiro, whose ninsho had recently died, leaving him in limbo between masters. Kenjiro had experienced the predations of multiple monks and possessed a burning hatred that he'd learned to hide behind perfect obedience. When Yoshimaru shared what he discovered, Kenjiro's response was immediate. "Tell me what we must do." The network they built over the following months was necessarily small and secretive. 6 boys total, ranging in age from 11 to 15, each carefully vetted and sworn to absolute secrecy. They communicated through a system of subtle gestures and coded phrases, passed information during routine temple activities, and met only in the deepest shadows of night when the risks of discovery were lowest. Their first acts of resistance were small but symbolically powerful. They began contaminating the monks' food with minor irritants, herbs that caused stomach upset, substances that produced temporary rashes or made the tea taste bitter. Nothing dangerous enough to cause serious harm or obvious enough to be traced back to deliberate sabotage, but sufficient to create an atmosphere of unease among their oppressors. The psychological effect on the boys themselves was profound. For the first time in their temple lives, they possessed agency. They were actors rather than victims, conspirators rather than helpless prey. The knowledge that they could strike back, even in small ways, began to restore something that years of abuse had nearly destroyed: their sense of themselves as human beings with the power to affect their own circumstances. As their confidence grew, so did their ambition. Using information gleaned from the hidden letters, they began reaching out to the network of survivors that Shinran had described. This required elaborate deceptions, forging reasons to visit nearby temples, bribing servants to carry messages, learning to read and write despite the restrictions placed on Chigo education. The breakthrough came when they made contact with a group of former temple boys who had established themselves as traveling merchants. These men, now in their 20s and 30s, had survived their own experiences and devoted themselves to helping current victims escape. They called themselves the Mukokai, the Facing West Society, after the Buddhist concept of rebirth in the Pure Land, for they saw themselves as helping souls escape suffering and find new life. The Mukokai had developed sophisticated methods for extracting Chigo from monasteries. They would arrive at temples posing as traveling merchants or pilgrims, establish contact with potential escapees, and create diversions that allowed boys to slip away unnoticed. Safe houses along trade routes provided shelter and new identity. A network of sympathetic merchants, farmers, and craftsmen offered employment to those who successfully escaped. But the system had limitations. It could only help boys who were already in contact with the network, who had demonstrated both the desire to escape and the courage to take enormous risks. Many Chigo, broken by years of abuse or genuinely convinced of their spiritual duty, could not be reached. Others were too closely watched by suspicious masters to attempt escape. For Yoshimaru and his conspirators, Contact with the Mukokai opened new possibilities, but also revealed the true dangers they faced. The escaped Chigo who were recaptured faced punishments that went far beyond the routine brutalities of temple life. Some were permanently crippled to prevent future escape attempts. Others were tortured to death as examples to remaining boys. The most fortunate were simply expelled from the temples to face certain starvation in a world that offered them no place. Despite these risks, the knowledge that escape was possible transformed the dynamic within the monastery. The 6 conspirators began preparing other Chigo for potential rescue, identifying those who might be receptive to help when the opportunity arose. They gathered intelligence about guard schedules, travel routes, and seasonal patterns that might affect escape attempts. The plan they eventually developed was breathtakingly audacious. Rather than attempting individual escapes, they would coordinate the simultaneous disappearance of every Chigo who could be trusted, potentially 15 boys total. This mass exodus would not only save more lives but also deliver a devastating blow to the monastery's operations, making it impossible to cover up or minimize what had happened. The date chosen was the night of the Autumn Moon Festival, when the monks would be gathered for special ceremonies and potentially distracted by ceremonial wine. Mukokai agents would be positioned at 3 different exit points from the temple complex. Travel documents, money, and disguises had been prepared. Safe houses along multiple escape routes were alerted and ready. But human systems, no matter how carefully planned, are vulnerable to human failure. 2 days before the planned escape, one of the boys, a 13-year-old named Tadamasa, approached his nuncho and confessed everything. Whether motivated by fear, genuine religious conviction, or some twisted form of Stockholm Syndrome, Tadamasa provided complete details about the conspiracy, the network, and the planned mass escape. The retribution was swift and merciless. Yoshimaru awoke to find himself surrounded by armed temple guards, his hands bound, his mouth gagged to prevent him from warning others. One by one, each member of the conspiracy was dragged from their beds and assembled in the main hall before the entire temple community. What followed was designed not just as punishment, but as theater, a public demonstration of what happened to those who challenged the temple's authority. The head abbot, a man whose gentle demeanor during public ceremonies masked a capacity for extraordinary cruelty, personally supervised the proceedings. Yoshimaru, as the identified leader, received special attention. His punishment began with the removal of 1 finger from each hand, not severed cleanly, but slowly crushed with wooden mallets. While the assembled monks and Chigo watched in horrified silence, the message was clear. These hands had written seditious messages, had conspired against the temple, and would never do so again. The other conspirators faced their own specialized torment. Kinjiro, who had helped recruit others to the cause, had his tongue pierced with hot needles. He would never again speak words of rebellion. The younger boys received lesser but still permanent marks, scars carved into their forearms that would forever identify them as former rebels, making escape impossible even if they survived their current punishment. But the physical brutality was only the beginning. The psychological torture was carefully calculated to destroy not just the conspirators' will to resist, but their basic sense of identity. They were forced to confess their sins publicly, to beg forgiveness from their ninja, to praise the mercy of the temple authorities who could have killed them but chose instead to offer them opportunities for redemption. This redemption came in the form of new roles within the temple hierarchy. They became cautionary examples, living reminders of the consequences of rebellion. Yoshimaru, his mutilated hands making him unsuitable for normal Chigo duties, was assigned to assist with the training of new arrivals. He was forced to participate in the very indoctrination process he had tried to subvert, to help convince frightened new boys that submission was their path to spiritual enlightenment. The irony was deliberate and devastating. The monastery's authorities understood that forcing former rebels to become instruments of oppression was a more complete victory than simply killing them would have been. Each time Yoshimaru had to comfort a terrified new Chigo, each time he had to explain why obedience to one's ninja was a sacred duty, a part of his soul died a little more. Yet even in this seemingly complete defeat, the seeds of future resistance survived. The network of former temple boys continued their work, learning from the failed escape attempt and adapting their methods. The Mukokai developed new protocols for vetting potential escapees, better methods for maintaining security, more sophisticated ways of identifying and avoiding informants. More importantly, the news of the rebellion spread despite the temple authorities' efforts to suppress it. Other Chigo in other monasteries heard whispered accounts of boys who had dared to fight back, who had at least tried to seize control of their own destiny. The story grew in the telling, becoming a legend that inspired future acts of resistance. In the mountains of Ki Peninsula, a group of Chigo at the Kamano Hongo Taisha began their own conspiracy, just months after news of Yoshimaru's rebellion reached them. Learning from his mistakes, they adopted even more stringent security measures, compartmentalized their organization so that no single member could betray the entire network, and developed multiple contingency plans for different scenarios. Their leader was a boy named Jiro, who had survived 3 years in the temple system and possessed both the intelligence to plan effectively and the charisma to inspire others. Unlike Yoshimaru, who had attempted to work within the existing temple structure, Jiro advocated for more direct action against their oppressors. "They have taught us that we are nothing," he told his fellow conspirators during a clandestine meeting in the temple's root cellar. "They have trained us to be grateful for abuse, to see our suffering as holy. But they have also taught us to move silently, to anticipate their needs, to understand their weaknesses. We will use their own training against them." Jiro's plan was more violent than Yoshimaru had been. Rather than attempting escape, he proposed eliminating specific monks who were known to be particularly brutal, making their deaths appear to be accidents or natural causes. The psychological impact on the surviving monks would create an atmosphere of fear that might lead to better treatment for remaining Chigo, while demonstrating that the boys were not as powerless as they appeared. The first target was Brother Nikarin, a monk notorious for his cruelty even by temple standard. Nikarin delighted in devising creative punishments for minor infractions, had permanently injured several Chigo through his discipline, and regularly boasted to other monks about his sexual conquests among the boys under his authority. The method chosen was poison, specifically, extract from the deathcap mushroom, which grew abundantly in the forests surrounding the temple. Jiro had learned about its properties from a former Chigo who had escaped and returned secretly to share information with current victims. The poison was virtually undetectable when mixed with the bitter tea that Nikarin drank every morning, and its effects mimicked those of natural illness. The execution of the plan required months of preparation. The boy assigned to serve Nikarin's morning tea had to be gradually trained to switch cups without detection to ensure that only the intended victim received the poisoned drink, and to behave normally when the monk inevitably became ill. Other conspirators had to establish alibis, gather the mushrooms during legitimate temple activities, and prepare the extract using improvised equipment. When Nikarin finally succumbed to what appeared to be a stomach ailment, his death created exactly the psychological impact that Jiro had hoped for. The remaining monks became paranoid and suspicious, hyper-vigilant about their food and drink, uncertain about which of their charges might pose a threat. The temple's atmosphere changed from one of casual brutality to nervous watchfulness. But the success also brought unexpected consequences. The increased surveillance made further assassinations nearly impossible, as monks began varying their routines and testing their food before consuming it. More significantly, the temple authorities brought in additional guards and implemented new security measures that made daily life even more restrictive for all Chigo. Jiro found himself facing the same dilemma that would confront resistance movements throughout history, whether acts of violence against oppressors ultimately helped or harmed the people they were meant to protect. Some of his fellow conspirators argued for escalating their campaign, believing that only through fear could they force changes in the system. Others contended that increased repression was making life worse for Chigo, who had no involvement in the resistance. The debate was resolved by external forces. A traveling inspector from the provincial government, conducting a routine review of temple finances, discovered irregularities that led to closer scrutiny of monastery operations. This official attention made the temple authorities extremely concerned about maintaining appearances, leading to temporary improvements in the treatment of Chigo, while the inspection was ongoing. During this brief respite, Jiro made a crucial decision. Rather than continuing to target individual monks, he would focus on documenting the systematic abuse occurring within the temple system. If government officials could be made aware of what was happening, if the evidence could be preserved and transmitted to higher authorities, perhaps real change might be possible through official channels. The documentation project required different skills than assassination. Jiro needed to learn to write fluently, to understand legal terminology, to gather physical evidence that would be convincing to officials who had never experienced temple life directly. He also needed to establish secure communication channels with the outside world to ensure that his evidence would reach sympathetic recipients rather than being intercepted by temple authorities. The work was painstakingly slow and incredibly dangerous. Each document had to be hidden after creation, each piece of evidence secured against discovery, each contact with the outside world carefully orchestrated to avoid detection. Jiro was essentially running an intelligence operation from within a closed institution, using resources and skills he had to develop entirely on his own. The breakthrough came when he established contact with a group of former samurai who had become Buddhist monks in their old age but retained connections to government officials. These men, horrified by what they learned about temple practices, agreed to serve as intermediaries with provincial authorities. They also possessed the social standing necessary to ensure that accusations against powerful monasteries would be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Jiro's dossier, when finally completed, represented months of careful observation and documentation. It included detailed accounts of specific incidents of abuse, financial records showing payments made to families for the purchase of boys, correspondence between monks discussing their illegal activities, and medical evidence of injuries sustained by Chego during their spiritual training. Perhaps most powerfully, it included testimonies from boys willing to risk everything by speaking truthfully about their experience. These accounts, written in the simple, direct language of children describing unthinkable suffering, carried an emotional impact that dry legal documents could never achieve. The submission of this evidence to provincial authorities marked a turning point in the resistance against temple-based exploitation of male children. For the first time, official government attention was focused specifically on the systematic abuse occurring within the monastery system. Investigations were launched. Some monks were removed from their positions, and new regulations were implemented requiring external oversight of Chego training programs. The changes were limited and often cosmetic. The fundamental power structures that enabled abuse remained largely intact, but they represented something unprecedented. Boys within the temple system now knew that their suffering was not invisible to the outside world, that resistance was possible, and that their voices could be heard by those with the power to intervene. Word of Jiro's success spread through the informal networks that connected Chego across different temples and regions. His methods were studied, adapted, and implemented by other groups of boys who had begun to organize their own resistance movement. The documentation approach proved particularly appealing because it offered hope for systemic change rather than mere individual escape or revenge. In monasteries across Japan, boys began keeping secret records of the abuse they witnessed and experienced. They developed codes for hiding these documents, methods for sharing information between temples, and strategies for ensuring that evidence would survive even if its creators were discovered and punished. The temple authorities, recognizing the threat posed by these documentation efforts, implemented increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. They conducted random searches of Chego quarters, interrogated boys suspected of suspicious activities, and offered rewards to informants willing to betray their fellow victims. The conflict between oppressor and oppressed became a shadow war fought with information and secrecy rather than open violence. Some resistance movements combined documentation with more direct action. In the great monastery complex of Mount Haya, a group led by a Chego named Kisuke developed a two-pronged strategy that involved both gathering evidence of abuse and sabotaging temple operations to reduce their effectiveness. Kisuke's followers became masters of subtle disruption. They would accidentally damage valuable manuscripts while copying them, introduce errors into important correspondence, and create scheduling conflicts that prevented monks from attending crucial meetings with potential donors or government officials. None of these actions was dramatic enough to prompt severe retaliation, but collectively they undermined the smooth functioning of the monastery and reduced its ability to acquire new victims. The genius of this approach was that it turned the temple's own emphasis on perfection and ritual precision against them in an environment where every ceremony had to be conducted flawlessly, and every document had to be absolutely correct. Even minor disruptions created disproportionate problems. The monks found themselves spending more time trying to identify and prevent sabotage than they could devote to their primary activities. Meanwhile, the documentation continued. Kisuke's network produced the most comprehensive record of temple abuse ever assembled, including detailed floor plans showing where assaults typically occurred, schedules of when monks were most likely to be alone with their victims, and psychological profiles of the most dangerous predators within the system. This intelligence proved invaluable when government investigators finally arrived at Mount High. Rather than being able to present a sanitized version of temple life, the authorities found themselves confronted with detailed evidence of systematic criminality. Several monks were arrested. The monastery lost its government funding, and new oversight mechanisms were implemented to prevent future abuses. But perhaps most importantly, the success at Mount High demonstrated that organized resistance could achieve concrete results. Boys in temples throughout Japan began to believe that change was possible, that their suffering was not inevitable, and that they possessed the power to affect their own circumstances. The resistance movements also began to evolve beyond their original focus on individual temple. Networks developed between different monasteries, allowing for the sharing of information and resources across broader geographic areas. Escape routes were established that could move boys from high-risk situations to safer environments. Safe houses were created where former Chigo could recover from their experiences and learn skills that would allow them to survive in the outside world. These broader networks also began to address one of the fundamental problems faced by escaped Chigo, the lack of support systems once they left the temple environment. Boys who had spent years in monastic institutions often had no understanding of normal social relationships, no practical skills for earning a living, and no family connections to provide assistance. The solution developed by the resistance networks was essentially the creation of alternative families, communities of survivors who could provide mutual support, share resources, and help newcomers adapt to life outside the temples. These communities often disguised themselves as legitimate businesses or religious organizations, operating artisan workshops, small farms, or trading companies that could provide both economic support and social cover for their members. One of the most successful of these communities was established in the port city of Sakai by a former Chigo named Dogen, who had escaped from a mountain monastery and spent several years learning maritime trading. His company, which specialized in importing Chinese goods, employed dozens of former temple boys and provided them with legitimate identities, practical skills, and a supportive environment for recovery. Dogen's operation also served as an intelligence hub for the broader resistance movement. Ships arriving from different ports carried coded messages between various networks, updates on conditions in different temples, and requests for assistance with specific rescue operations. The company's legitimate business activities provided perfect cover for these communications, as merchants were expected to maintain extensive correspondence with contacts throughout the region. The success of communities like Dogen's began to change the fundamental equation that had made temple exploitation possible. Previously, boys had no realistic alternative to accepting their escape meant certain death from starvation or exposure. Now, for the first time, there were genuine opportunities for former Chigo to build new lives for themselves. This development had profound psychological effects on boys still trapped within the temple system. Knowing that escape was not only possible but could lead to genuine freedom and happiness transformed how they viewed their current circumstances. Abuse that had seemed like a permanent, inescapable reality now appeared as a temporary condition that could be overcome through courage and planning. The temple authorities recognized the threat posed by these alternative communities and attempted various countermeasures. They pressured government officials to investigate the suspicious businesses that seemed to employ unusually large numbers of young men without clear family history. They spread rumors about former Chigo being inherently unreliable or criminal. They even hired informants to infiltrate the survivor communities and report on their activities. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The survivor communities had developed sophisticated security measures, legitimate business operations that could withstand scrutiny, and strong internal bonds that made infiltration extremely difficult. More importantly, they had the support of increasing numbers of ordinary citizens who had become aware of temple abuses and sympathized with the victims. This broader social support represented a crucial shift in the context surrounding temple-based exploitation. What had once been an accepted, if not widely discussed, aspect of religious life was increasingly seen as a shameful practice that reflected poorly on Buddhism and Japanese society as a whole. Public opinion slowly but steadily was turning against the institutions that had perpetuated these abuses for centuries. The change in social attitudes was accelerated by the growing availability of written accounts detailing temple life from the perspective of victims. Former Chigo who had learned to write began producing memoirs, testimonies, and exposés that reached educated audiences throughout Japan. These documents circulated through informal networks and sometimes even published by sympathetic merchants or scholars, provided the first widespread public awareness of what actually occurred within monastery walls. One of the most influential of these accounts was written by a man named Shinran, the same individual whose letter had inspired Yoshimaru's original resistance movement. Now in his 40s and established as a successful craftsman, Shinran produced a detailed memoir of his years as a temple boy that was both unflinchingly honest about the horrors he had experienced and hopeful about the possibility of recovery and renewal. Shinran's account was particularly powerful because it avoided both sensationalism and self-pity. Instead, it presented a clear-eyed analysis of how systematic abuse had been disguised as spiritual training. He explained the psychological techniques used to break down boys' resistance, the economic incentives that motivated temples to acquire new victims, and the social structures that had allowed these practices to continue unchallenged for so long. But perhaps most importantly, Shinran's memoir demonstrated that survival was possible, that former victims could overcome their experiences and build meaningful, productive lives. This message of hope resonated strongly with current Chigo who were beginning to organize their own resistance movements, providing them with both inspiration and practical guidance for their efforts. The circulation of accounts like Shinran's memoir created a feedback loop that strengthened the resistance movement at multiple levels. Boys still trapped in temples gained access to information that helped them understand their situations and plan their own escape attempts. Survivor communities found validation for their experiences and encouragement to continue their work. Most importantly, members of the general public who had been unaware of temple abuses began to demand official action to address these problems. This growing public awareness coincided with broader changes in Japanese society that made reform more likely. The rise of a merchant class with increasing political influence, the gradual centralization of government authority, and the growing emphasis on rational administration over traditional privilege all created conditions more favorable to protecting victims of institutional abuse. The first major legal breakthrough came in 1189 AD, when the Kamakura shogunate issued new regulations governing the operation of Buddhist monasteries. These rules, while still allowing temples considerable autonomy, required external oversight of the treatment of Chigo and established specific penalties for monks who engaged in sexual abuse of minors. The regulations were far from enforcement was irregular, penalties were often light, and many temples found ways to evade oversight while maintaining their abusive practices. But they represented official recognition that the treatment of temple boys was a matter of legitimate government concern, not merely an internal religious issue beyond secular authority. More importantly, the new regulations provided a legal framework that resistance movements could use to support their activities. Boys who escaped from temples could now seek official protection rather than being automatically returned to their master. Evidence of abuse could be presented to government officials with reasonable expectation that it would be investigated rather than ignored. These legal changes, combined with the growing network of survivor communities and the increasing sophistication of resistance movements within temples, began to create a new dynamic around the exploitation of male children in religious institutions. What had once been a closed system operating without external scrutiny was now subject to multiple forms of pressure from victims, survivors, and sympathetic members of the broader society. The response of temple authorities to these mounting challenges varied considerably. Some monasteries attempted to reform their practices, implementing new safeguards for Chigo and restricting the behavior of monks known to be abusive. Others simply became more secretive about their activities, developing better methods for avoiding detection while continuing their exploitation of vulnerable boys. A few monasteries, recognizing that the old system was becoming untenable, began transitioning away from the use of child attendants entirely. They recruited adult servants for domestic duties, hired professional scribes for copying work, and modified their religious practices to eliminate roles that had traditionally been filled by Chigo. But many temples, particularly those in remote locations with limited government oversight, continued their traditional practices with minimal changes. These institutions became refuges for monks who were unwilling or unable to adapt to new expectations about the treatment of children, creating pockets of particularly intense abuse even as conditions improved elsewhere. The resistance movements adapted to this evolving landscape by developing more targeted strategies. Rather than attempting to reform the entire temple system, they began focusing their efforts on the institutions and individuals that posed the greatest ongoing threats to vulnerable boys. Intelligence networks identified the most dangerous monasteries. Escape routes were optimized to extract victims from high-risk situations, and survivor communities prepared to absorb larger numbers of refugees as enforcement actions displaced boys from shuttered temples. This more focused approach proved highly effective. By concentrating resources on the worst cases, resistance movements were able to achieve dramatic results in specific situations while building momentum for broader reform. Success stories began to accumulate, temples forced to close due to scandal, prominent monks prosecuted for abuse, survivor communities thriving and expanding. Each victory, no matter how limited, provided encouragement for continued resistance and demonstrated that change was possible. Boys still trapped in abusive situations could see concrete evidence that escape was feasible, that justice was achievable, and that they were not forgotten by the outside world. The accumulation of these individual successes began to create broader changes in Japanese society's approach to the protection of children. What had started as isolated resistance movements within specific temples evolved into a general recognition that adults had responsibilities to protect young people from exploitation, regardless of the institutional context in which that exploitation occurred. This shift in social consciousness extended beyond religious institutions to influence attitudes toward other forms of child abuse and exploitation. The same arguments used to challenge temple practices, that children deserved protection, that adult authority could be legitimately questioned, and that systematic abuse required systematic responses, began to be applied to problems in other areas of society. The boy who had knelt on those cold monastery steps, who had felt the weight of his new life settling around him like chains, was no longer alone. Across Japan, in temples and safe houses, in government offices and merchant shops, in the hidden networks that connected survivors and the growing communities that supported them, thousands of people were working to ensure that his story would not be repeated. The resistance that had begun with whispered conversations between frightened children had grown into a movement that was transforming Japanese society's approach to the protection of its most vulnerable members. The journey was far from complete. Many boys still suffered in remote temples. Many perpetrators escaped justice. Many survivors struggled with lasting trauma. But the trajectory was clear. The age of systematic, unchallenged exploitation of male children in religious institutions was coming to an end, not through the mercy of those in power, but through the courage of those who had suffered under that power and refused to accept their suffering as inevitable. The resistance continued, one rescued boy at a time, one reformed temple at a time, one changed mind at a time, until the unthinkable became inevitable, and the impossible became real. By the dawn of the 13th century, the transformation was undeniable. Where once temple bells had tolled over silent suffering, they now rang over communities where former victims had found their voices. The scattered safe houses had evolved into established neighborhoods in major cities, places where men bore the subtle marks of their past, but walked with the dignity of those who had reclaimed their lives. Yoshimaru, now graying at the temples but still possessed of the fierce determination that had sparked the first resistance, stood before a gathering unlike any that had come before. In the main hall of what had once been an abandoned warehouse in Kyoto, Nearly 200 men sat in careful rows. Some bore the weathered faces of craftsmen, others the ink-stained fingers of scribes, still others the calloused hands of farmers. What united them was not visible to the casual observer, but it connected them more deeply than blood or birth. They were all survivors. 23 years ago, Yoshimaru began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. A boy named Kenjiro whispered to me in a temple corridor that he wanted to see the ocean. He had never seen anything beyond monastery walls, and he dreamed of waves and endless sky. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Kenjiro sits among us today, not as that frightened child, but as a master shipwright, whose vessels carry merchants safely across the very waters he once could only imagine. A man in the third row, his face weathered by sea wind, raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. Around him, others nodded with the quiet pride of those who understood the magnitude of such a transformation. But we are not here to celebrate only our own journeys, Yoshimaru continued. We are here because there are still boys who whisper dreams in dark corridors, still children who believe they are powerless against the weight of tradition and authority. We are here because our work is not finished. The gathering was the first formal congress of what had become known as the Restoration Fellowship, a network that now spanned the entire Japanese archipelago. What had begun as desperate cooperation between individual survivors had evolved into something unprecedented, a coordinated effort to transform the fundamental structures that had enabled systematic abuse. The fellowship's influence extended far beyond its membership. In the decades since the first escapes, former Chigo had established themselves in nearly every significant trade and profession. They had become doctors who understood trauma, teachers who recognized the signs of abuse, merchants who provided employment without questions about missing family histories. Their shared experience had created an invisible network of support that extended protection to vulnerable people throughout society. Master Endo, a former temple boy who had become one of Kyoto's most respected builders, presented the fellowship's latest initiative. We have acquired the property known as the Riverside Monastery, he announced, producing a formal deed. It will be transformed into our first training center, a place where survivors can learn trades, where their children can receive education, and where the methods we have developed can be taught to others. The choice of location was deeply symbolic. The Riverside Monastery had once been among the most notorious temples in the region, known for its harsh treatment of Chigo and the powerful monks who had operated with complete impunity. Now it would serve as a beacon of hope, its halls filled with the voices of those who had once been silent. The transformation of the old monastery represented more than just a symbolic victory. It demonstrated the fellowship's evolution from a desperate resistance movement into a legitimate social institution with real power to effect change. The legal acquisition of the property had required negotiation with government officials, cooperation with religious authorities, and the kind of social standing that came only from decades of proving their worth as productive members of society. As the Congress continued, reports arrived from across the country. The Fellowship's intelligence network, now formalized and extensive, tracked conditions in remaining temples and identified new victims who needed assistance. Their methods had become sophisticated. They maintained contacts with inactive monasteries, operated safe houses along established escape routes, and had developed legal strategies for protecting boys who sought their help. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned to work within the system rather than merely against it. Former Chigo had entered government service, using their positions to craft and enforce new regulations. Others had joined reformed Buddhist sects, helping to establish new models of monastic life that emphasized genuine spiritual development over exploitation. Still others had become teachers and scholars, ensuring that the history of temple abuse would not be forgotten or repeated. The afternoon session of the Congress was devoted to what they called prevention work, efforts to identify and protect vulnerable children before they could be victimized. This represented a fundamental shift in approach. Rather than simply responding to abuse after it occurred, they were now working to prevent it from happening in the first place. Matsuda, a former Chigo who had become a respected physician, presented his research on identifying families at risk of selling their children to temples. Poverty remains the primary factor, he explained. But it is not the only one. We have found that families disrupted by warfare, natural disasters, or social upheaval are particularly vulnerable to the false promises of temple recruiters. The fellowship had developed a comprehensive response to this challenge. They provided emergency assistance to families in crisis, offered alternative placements for children whose families could not care for them, and worked with local authorities to ensure that such placements were genuinely beneficial rather than exploited. Their success in preventing abuse was measured not in dramatic rescues, but in the quiet lives of children who had never experienced the horrors that had shaped their own childhood. As evening approached, the Congress turned to its most ambitious project yet, the establishment of a formal school for former temple boys and their children. The institution would provide not just basic education, but also training in the skills needed to thrive in a rapidly changing society. More importantly, it would serve as a model for how education could be structured to support rather than exploit vulnerable young people. "We are not merely creating a school," explained Oko, one of the few women involved in the fellowship's leadership. Her own story was remarkable. The daughter of a former Chigo who had dedicated her life to supporting survivors and their families. "We are creating a new vision of what it means to nurture the potential of children, rather than exploit their vulnerability." The school would be revolutionary in its approach. Rather than the harsh discipline and rigid hierarchy that characterized traditional Buddhist education, it would emphasize individual development, critical thinking, and the kinds of practical skills that would enable graduates to support themselves and their family. Perhaps most importantly, it would be staffed by people who understood trauma and were committed to healing rather than perpetuating cycles of abuse. As the formal sessions concluded, the gathering took on a different character. Men who had once been isolated in their suffering now shared stories of triumph and renewal. They spoke of marriages and children, of businesses built from nothing, of contributions to their communities that extended far beyond their role as survivors. They laughed together, these men who had once believed they would never have cause for joy. But beneath the celebration was a deeper understanding. They knew that their work would never be truly complete. Each generation would face new forms of exploitation, new institutions that claimed authority over the vulnerable, new justifications for the abuse of power. The specific horrors of the temple system might be ending, but the fundamental human capacity for cruelty and exploitation would remain. What they had created, however, was something that could outlast any individual institution or system of abuse. They had demonstrated that resistance was possible, that recovery was achievable, and that systematic change could emerge from the courage of those who had suffered most. They had proven that victims were not powerless, that traditional authority was not unquestionable, and that society could be transformed by those it had once discarded. The Congress ended with a ceremony that honored both the dead and the living. Names were read aloud. Boys who had not survived their time in the temples, men who had died before seeing the changes they had helped to create, and current members of the fellowship who continued the work. Each name was followed by a moment of silence, then by the sound of a single bell, clear and strong in the evening air. The final speaker was an elderly man named Tai Chi, one of the few survivors of the very earliest resistance effort. His voice was weak, but his words carried the authority of lived experience. "We who were once voiceless have found our voices," he said simply. "We who were once powerless have discovered our strength. We who were once alone have built community. We who were once without hope have created hope for others. This is our victory, not that we have forgotten our suffering, but that we have transformed it into something that serves life rather than death, healing rather than harm." As the gathering dispersed, men embraced who had once been strangers, united only by trauma. They made plans for the future, exchanged information about family and work, and promised to maintain the connections that had sustained them through the darkest time. They walked out into the Kyoto night as free men, carrying with them the knowledge that they had accomplished something extraordinary. The boy who had once knelt on cold monastery steps, trembling with fear and confusion, lived on in their memories not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a reminder of the capacity for transformation. His story had become their story. His fear had become their strength. His silence had become their voice. The chains that had once bound him had been broken, not by divine intervention or the mercy of the powerful, but by the patient, persistent work of ordinary people who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable. The resistance had succeeded not because it had destroyed the temple system, though it had fundamentally transformed it, but because it had created something better. In place of institutions that consumed the vulnerable, they had built communities that nurtured them. In place of systems that perpetuated abuse, they had established networks that prevented it. In place of silence and shame, they had fostered truth and healing. The temple bells still rang across Japan, but their sound now carried different meaning. For some, they continued to mark the rhythm of spiritual practice. For others, they served as reminders of past suffering. But for the members of the Restoration Fellowship and the countless lives they had touched, those bells had become something else entirely. A call to vigilance, a summons to service, and a promise that no child would ever again face alone the darkness that had once consumed them all. The work continued, as it always would, but now it was sustained by hope rather than desperation, by community rather than isolation, by the knowledge that change was not only possible, but inevitable. When ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage, the age of unchallenged exploitation was ending, replaced by an era in which the vulnerable would always have protectors, the silenced would always have voices, and the darkness would always be challenged by those who had learned to kindle light.